Canada, we're making too many enemies too fast. Well, this is a bit of a digression on the Canada thinking for itself thematic for a subset of micro lectures that I think are urgently necessary because we are in a crisis of non-thinking with really practical consequences. But a brief digression requires me to say that one of the pressures on us in the context of this national non-thinking is the fact that we have mindlessly, in an incredible way, very, very rapidly, created very powerful enemies. I know it's very strange for a Canadian to say. It's hard for me to even believe. It might be even hard for you to believe. I've said it before, but you may not have really internalized it. And certainly outside of Canada, people will be very surprised to learn that we have so many real enemies. How did this happen? Before we get to how this happened, how we can unwind this, let me just say who these enemies are. And what the tally of total enemies indeed to allies is. And it's not a very favorable one, not one that suggests great prospects for survival and success. Yes, I said survival and success because, of course, historically, a country that has too many enemies, too many powerful enemies, indeed powerful enemies at the gates, and that's us, does not last very long. Countries last about 60 years in the modern sense. Then they collapse. I think I've said this before, constitutional collapse or some sort of war, annexation, cataclysm, 60 years. Canada's been going 152, 153. We're past our shelf life. Now we have to fight for it. So some historical laws of statecraft and strategy are back at our gates. Can we fend for ourselves in this context or be a little more cunning? Here are our allies. I think they're indisputable. The USA, right? 330 million people. And most of the EU within NATO, let's give it 500 million, including the UK, whether Brexit happens or not. We approach somewhere near 1 billion. Okay? A little bit less than 1 billion, to be honest. But of course, strong proviso here, the USA, right, our borders, our historical ally has become a really capricious ally. Temperamental. Will they in a pinch defend us? Well, today you might say it depends on whether the president feels like it. Can we really depend on that protection, on that security guarantee? I'm not sure. Many countries would say, well, maybe, but we really ought to prepare to defend ourselves. And that is the European calculation today. Whether they can execute is a different matter. We have not yet internalized that real risk. Okay? But the greater risk is the fact that we are far outweighed by enemies today than allies. Let me show it to you. China, 1.5 billion. How did this happen? China. Well, I think I've spoken about it in past lectures. We'll get back to the China conflict. We made an enemy of China very quickly, very foolishly, and it will be very difficult to unwind. We also don't realize how close geographically the Chinese are to us. We'll get to that. Russia, 150 million people, enemy since 2014. Obviously, Russia has become an enemy of Canada since 2014. We'll talk about the proximity of Russia to Canada as well. But already we're well past the quantum of allies in terms of the population represented by these states. Now, just a quick qualifier here. Please don't come back to me and say, well, this government is not representative of the state. That's a nonsensical counter. For all intents and purposes, these are legitimate governments. We may not like them. That's not the point. International affairs and politics, and in many cases, human affairs, not matters of love and like, dislike. They're a question just of objective facts. And we have an adversarial relationships with these very big countries. Then, Iran. Let us hope there's no war in the offing, but Iran is a country of 80 million people. We have no embassy in Iran. We promised to reinstate the embassy. That's not anywhere on the horizon. We have no effective relationship with Iran. Again, I'm not speaking to the quality or non-quality of the government It's an objective fact. Saudi Arabia, 20 million. And then, of course, Venezuela, 20 million. All told, we are talking about more than 2 billion people represented by governments with whom we have effectively enemy or adversarial relationships. That's a 2-to-1 ratio vis-a-vis our allies. And in the context of an American ally that is highly unstable institutionally and capricious politically. It's not obvious that they'll defend us in certain contexts of conflict with these other countries. Now you might say, what is the practical consequence of this? Are we going to go to war with these countries? Not necessarily. But as I said, if we do, we could be in trouble if the Americans don't win or they don't defend us properly. And if we can't defend ourselves. But more materially, and here's the larger point, these are countries that, because they represent such a big mass of the total human population, will veto our efforts to do anything internationally. Climate change. You want to do something on climate change? You must work through and with China. If we had an adversarial relationship with China, we're irrelevant. It is not China that's irrelevant, we're irrelevant. We're 38 million people. If you want to do something major in the Arctic, better not have an adversarial relationship with Russia. They are, with us, the giant country, but much more deep in infrastructure, in terms of military power, in terms of Arctic knowledge. So if we want to do major things in the Arctic, better to have a reasonable relationship with Russia. And if we want to be anywhere near relevant in the Middle East, and we're not right now, these are, in fact, the two major countries, Iran and Saudi Arabia. We have adversarial relationships with both, which means anything we stand to do or fancy doing in the Middle East will be vetoed outright. And by the way, the other major country, indeed the major outside force, is Russia. So these three countries control the macro questions in the Middle East. We are irrelevant. Okay? So it's not just enemies at the gates, it's enemies in terms of anything we wish to do internationally, in environmental terms, in economic terms, in terms of human development, even in terms of getting our citizens out of prisons when they are in trouble. So those are the practical consequences of enemies at the gate. But let me present something that's a little more menacing and, to me, more anxiety-inducing. So the anxiety comes from this fact. Not only is the enemy or adversary to ally ratio 2-to-1 in our disfavor, to our disadvantage, but where exactly geographically are these adversaries versus our allies? Remember our acre framework, right? Okay? A, we love the A, C, R, E, right? America, China, Russia, Europe. It's our essential existential game. Right? All success or collapse this century internationally will flow through this basic logic. And by the way, through the relationships betwixt these four vectors. But of the four vectors, two are now enemies. China's an enemy and Russia's an enemy. They are our immediate neighbors. China is closer to us than it is to Australia in many ways, through Northwest Territories, through Yukon, through British Columbia. Closer to Beijing than is Sydney, Australia. And Russia is, of course, right around the bend over the Arctic. Right? We have enemy relationships with them. The Americans are our deepest allies, but they're capricious. So we've made two major enemies at the gates, with the Americans not necessarily committed in all circumstances, right? Unless it's an America first conviction to defend us, and the Europeans certainly not capable of defending us in most scenarios, I would say. And forget about the Australians. We'll never go to war with them to defend Canadian territory, and the reverse, right? So that's a bit of a fairy tale. But it's utterly unwise because we don't realize with whom we've made enemies. These are not abstractions. These are our neighbors. So let us think a little bit more cleverly and think for ourselves. Because when we talk about these relationships and we talk about these ones, we need to think through in a brutally Canadian framework, in a Canadian vocabulary, in Canadian terms, in our interests. Stay tuned.